Hello, my random viewers, and welcome to Randomly Offensive. Today, we are going to start the story of Genetic Blessings, Part 1 and Chapter 1. Our story begins with a 30-year-old police officer by the name of Al Menasta, who drives down the road of Nevada in a small little Toyota Prius on his way to clock in at the police station in Las Vegas. And as he drives, he goes through the same thoughts that he goes through every day he drives to the police station, which are wonders and doubts if he had chosen the right career and if being a cop was the right way to protect those in need and put away those who are a danger to society. And with all the complications of the modern day, with all the eyes of biased looking down at him, he is always afraid that he may lose his job or worse, and he never knows what the right move is to make. And so every day he goes to work, he wonders if he made the right choice. And as he walks into the police station to don the uniform, he stands at a 5'11" with ash brown hair and hazel eyes, with an average amount of muscle mass with some muscle definition. As an incredibly average-looking man, no one looks twice at him when he's walking around on the streets, but in his uniform, people seem afraid. "I see you're still sporting that sad excuse of a car," says a fellow police officer as Al closes the locker door. "It's a great car," he says. "It's great on the gas mileage, and it's good for the environment, so it's a win-win for everybody," he says with a happy smile on his face as he's walking out. And the fellow police officer responds, "Yeah, well, I don't think you're ever going to be able to impress that girl of yours with that thing." And as Al walks out the door, he turns around, opening the doors with his back. "I don't have to impress her, I just have to get to know her," he says, as he walks out and begins his rounds in Vegas as the police officer. He is pulling over those who are driving over the limit, helping old women cross the street as he does his everyday normal rounds. He begins being bored like he is every day, with excitement just no longer arising the way it was 5 years ago when he first became a police officer. And he catches himself looking at his watch far more often than he ever had, waiting for the day to be over. Al's stomach begins to growl, and so he looks down at his stomach. "Hungry already? You'd think you'd be able to last at least 2 more hours," he says, and his stomach continues to growl. All right. I guess if you're hungry, he says as he goes into a nearby convenience store to grab a cheap sandwich off the shelf. However, as he's picking out what kind of sandwich he wants, he sees a man in a plain white t-shirt and blue jeans walking around the gas station somewhat nervously, as if he's shopping but not grabbing anything. And so Al decides to purchase the sandwich, and then he walks out of the gas station and slips around the corner to where he is unseen and waits. And waits for about 3 to 4 minutes until he hears the commotion of a robbery. And as he peeks around the corner back into the gas station, he sees the man in the white t-shirt holding up a Glock to the gas station clerk as he demands him to put all the money from the cash register into a bag. And so Al quickly steps back into the gas station, pulling his gun out, telling the man to drop his weapon. Hey, buddy, I'm gonna need you to drop that gun and get on your knees, says Al, with his gun now pointing at the robber. However, the robber just takes a quick glance out of the corner of his eyes.
This doesn't concern you, go away,
he says, and Al just smirks at this. No, I'm pretty sure it concerns me, he says, still pointing the gun at the robber as he uses his other hand to flick his badge. And the robber ignores him, still demanding the cashier to put money in the bag. Listen, dude, I am gonna have to ask you to drop your weapon and get on your knees and let me take you into the precinct, because what you're doing is kind of illegal, he says, with his gun still pointing to the robber. However, the robber looks back at Al.
I'm going to continue doing what I'm doing, and you do whatever you want,
says the robber. And Al is now getting a little confused about this and feeling like he's getting ignored. And so he decides to drop the friendly demeanor. Look here, pal, he says. I'm gonna have to force you on your knees without your weapon and bring you in, because I'm sure you're in a tight spot and probably not thinking clearly and you're probably desperate. But what you're doing needs to stop, and if you don't stop, I will be forced to take legal action to take you out. And so the robber looks at Al again and begins to slowly move his gun towards Al. Nope, don't do that, says Al. I will have to put a bullet in your head if you do that. And the robber just continues moving the gun.
Go ahead. Put a bullet in my head and see what happens.
And now the robber's gun is pointing to Al, with Al's gun pointing at the robber, and the robber begins to pull the trigger, so Al pulls his even faster and his gun goes off. The bullet hits the chest of the robber and puts a hole in the robber's shirt. However, no blood is coming out of the robber. And the robber looks down at his chest.
Well, that answers that question,
says the robber as Al looks slightly confused.
Apparently my body can react as fast as a speeding bullet,
he says as he looks back at Al. React as fast as a what now? Says Al as he's somewhat confused, and so the robber drops his gun and then extends his hand out to the bag of the cash, and his hand becomes a puddle, and his hand takes the form of what looks to be pudding as his arm materializes into more of a liquid and absorbs the bag, and Al watches. The clerk is freaking out, and as Al watches the man's arm morph back into a human hand with the bag now consumed, Al is still trying to process what he had just witnessed. I don't think that's normal, says Al, and now the man begins walking intimidatingly to Al, and so Al pulls the trigger on his gun again, and this time it hits the arm of the robber, and Al sees the bullet go into his arm, and the arm just morphs again as pudding, consuming the bullet, and now Al isn't sure what's going on, nor what he is going to do when this man makes it to him. As the robber walks closer to Al, Al quickly looks around his environment and sees two customers filling up with gas. And so he looks back at the robber, but now the robber is standing toe-to-toe with Al, with the gun pressed against the robber's chest.
Well, says the robber, do you have anything to say at this extraordinary display?
He says to Al, and Al just looks at the man, No, not really, besides how I'm gonna put this in my report, he says. And so the robber grabs the gun, and his hand once again morphs into a pudding-like substance as he absorbs Al's gun, and Al quickly lets go of the gun, panicking. "Oh, that is really disgusting," he says as he's now stumbling out of the gas station and walking backwards, showing fear. And the robber tells Al,
"I told you to stay out of it. I told you that this was none of your business. And now I'm going to absorb you the way I've absorbed your gun."
And Al just looks at him. "I can't stay out of it. It's my job. I would like to know what is going on," he says, still walking backwards. And the robber is now speeding up his step as he's walking closer and closer to Al. And Al has finally walked backwards long enough to where he has made it to one of the customers he saw filling up with gas, and grabs the gas pump out of their hands and shoots a stream of gasoline directly to the robber, and then grabs a lighter out of his pocket and quickly lights it over the stream, igniting the gasoline, catching the robber on fire, while he quickly takes the top jacket of his uniform off and wraps the handle of the gas pump to prevent flames from falling down the pipes, and he throws it down, watching the robber burn and scream. But then the robber begins to laugh, and as he walks out of the flames, still caught on fire, Al can see his body morphing in much more of a liquid as the robber's body seems to be melting as it is trying to consume the flames. "This has got to be a bad dream," says Al, and the robber looks at him.
"I don't know how my body reacts to heat, but I think we're about to find out,"
says the robber. And so the robber then becomes nothing but a puddle, and the stream of his oddly mutated organs and skin and muscle just floats into a drain nearby the curb. And Al looks at this and watches this, trying to figure out what the hell happened. And as he waits for his chief to show up, he knows he's going to be scalded for not calling him back up, for not doing what he was supposed to do, and he's going to be out of work for a few days. And so he sits and waits for him to either get fired or on temporary probation. The chief finally shows up, with Al still sitting on the curb of the gas station, trying to wrap his head around the past events that have occurred and trying to understand what the hell just happened, for he doesn't even believe his own memories, he doesn't believe his own eyes. And when the chief asks him, "What the hell happened? Are you gonna be okay?" Al can only respond, "Well, I thought I was gonna be late for my date tonight," he says. And then he looks up at the chief. "You won't believe me what happened if I told you, but there's security footage in the gas station. You can check them out," he says. And so while he waits, the chief finally returns, and Al stands up and looks at the chief. "So, what am I gonna put in my report?" he says. And the chief looks at Al with very serious eyes. "Nothing. There will be no report. You will not say a single thing about this to anybody. Do you understand?" And Al nods. He figured that would be the response. Whenever something supernatural or abnormal happens, people like to keep it under wraps to reduce fear. However, Al has never thought this was the best way to go. And how often has events like this happened that no one was allowed to talk about. And if these events have happened in the past, could they have been prevented if they had just known about them? However, Al does not vocalize any of his thoughts and just nods, and the chief sends him on a 4-day hiatus to recover from the mental trauma that he had just endured. However, it is time for him to get ready for his date with a woman he met quite some time ago by the name of Jasmine, a banker who he had met 2 years ago at a park, and they have gotten along quite swimmingly. Even though they have always had two different views on the world, and she has always been far more cynical, they seem to complement each other's flaws, and they benefit each other's pros while consistently helping each other survive this insane and crazy world that they live in. Not only that, but she has never been the type of woman to have to prove herself, just like he has always been the type of man not to prove himself, and they just simply get along without having to play any games. And though she seems to make much more than him, she oftentimes allows him to pay when he feels like he needs to for any outings that they go out on, and any dates that he decides to pay for. She never takes offense, and so he will not cancel this date, for she means an awful lot to him, and he is fond of the possible future that they have together. And so with 20 minutes to spare, he gets ready, leaves his apartment, and goes to the restaurant of where they will be meeting. As Al leaves his apartment and heads to the restaurant of Vegas, as he drives away from his home, which he lives on the outskirts of Nevada, even though it is a long drive to where he works in Vegas, it gives him peace of mind and a lack of people and a lack of traffic, so that he can think whenever he is driving anywhere. However, he is driving much faster than usual because he does not want time to think. Not today. He cannot think about what had happened. He needs to try to forget it, and he cannot allow it to corrupt his personality and his fondness over Jasmine. So he tries to push it back, though the image of the man's body morphing into a pudding-like substance continues to creep into his brain. And so he is finally relieved when he makes it to the restaurant, and as he walks in, he sees Jasmine already at the table, for he is always late and she's come to expect it. And as he walks, he just can't help but admire the beauty of her. Jasmine, as she sits at the table, looks at him. "Well, you look like shit," she says, and he nods. "It's been a rough day," he says as he sits down, and she looks at him and asks if he'd like to talk about it, and he quickly shakes his head no and begins to order. Jasmine is a 5'9" tall woman with more of a reddish hair that is always put in a bun. And though she is a few years older than Al, she seems to have a youthful personality and comes off as a young, spirited, fun-loving person with a skeptical mind of whether or not she should trust people around her. And as they have their conversations and he asks her how her day was at the bank, The response was the same as always, just a normal day with nothing exciting going on. However, after about 30 to 40 minutes pass, she notices and can't get past that something is bothering Al, and Al is not the happy, loving guy he normally is, and she can see something bothering him in his eyes, so she decides to ask him what was wrong, and he avoids the question over and over and over, and so she finally starts getting upset and looks at him seriously, dead in the eyes. "I've never seen you like this before, Al," she says. "You need to tell me, what is bothering you?" And he finally looks at her, knowing that she might be thinking it's something else, something that has to do with their relationship. He decides to risk looking like a loon, and he needs to get it out anyway. It has been boiling and boiling within him, so he decides to finally tell her, "Well, you're not gonna believe me, but there was an incident with a man that was robbing a gas station, and when I shot him, his body's just consumed the bullets, as if his body was turning into pudding," he says, afraid that this was going to cause her to wonder about his mental stability. However, she just leaned in, as if she was curious and interested. So he took this as a chance to continue, as an invitation to continue. He told her that the man was able to absorb an entire bag of cash by turning his arm into a liquid substance, and that even catching him on flames didn't kill him. Instead, he just melted into a fluid puddle and was able to move into a drain as the form of a puddle. And Jasmine then became incredibly serious. "Where was this at, you said?" "Well, it was just at a gas station about 3 blocks from here," he says. And then she quickly stands up and runs out of the restaurant, to Al's surprise. As he yells for her to stop, he just gives up and leans back. "Well, that's it. I scared her away," he says, as a couple sits in the table next to him and leans over. "If you're trying to impress her, you should probably come up with a more realistic story," they say, as Al just ignores them and pays the check and heads home. Al begins to rub his head in frustration, for he's not sure exactly why Jasmine ran off, but he knows it probably wasn't for anything good, and he drives outside of Vegas on his way back to the apartment and tries calling Jasmine a couple times, but there's no response. And in the middle of his drive, with his car being the only one on the road in the dead of night, his headlights begin to show the form of a person, and as the car gets closer, he begins to slow down, and it is the robber standing there with an evil grin on his face. And Al is now panicking at the sight of this man, and the memories of what he had witnessed at the gas station flood his brain. And so Al decides to speed up the car and rams into the robber. However, the robber's body once again morphs into a pudding-like substance, and the body wraps around the car, and the robber's hand stretches out and slams his hand on the front doors of the Prius. And now Al is staring eye to eye with the robber as he's flying down the road, with the pudding-like substance body flooding the car. And the robber then manages to slowly start picking up the car, causing the momentum of the both of them to stop. With the car now being picked up, Al can see the front of his Prius being absorbed by the body of the robber.
I told you to stay out of it,
says the robber as the car becomes more and more absorbed in his body, getting closer to Al being absorbed with it. Al begins trying to kick out the back windshield of the Prius to escape while panicking at what's about to become of him. The Prius begins to crumble, and you can hear the crunching of the metal, and you can hear the glass breaking on the windows and the windshield as the car is being crushed as it is being absorbed by the robber's body. The Prius is now almost fully consumed by the robber's body as Al finally kicks out the back windshield and dives out of the car. However, at this point, the car has become fully consumed and Al can feel his left foot being snatched by the pudding-like substance of the robber, and he can feel himself slowly being pulled into the robber. And in a panic, he goes to grab the handgun that he normally has on his hip, but it is not there. And so he looks at the robber's evil smile and angry eyes as he's being consumed, and his life flashes before his eyes. And so he closes his eyes to wait for the unthinkable to happen. And with his eyes closed, that is when he hears a loud, booming sound, followed by multiple footsteps and grunts. And when he quickly opens his eyes, he sees the robber knocked back with his foot now being released. And standing before the robber are 3 people, 2 men and a woman, in a black military-style uniform, with each of them holding one long rod with a red spike at the top and a circular barred handle in the middle. And as he looks at them, there are 2 strong-looking men, at least 6'5". But then the woman looks at him, and he can't believe his eyes. "Jasmine?" he says. "Yeah, sorry, Al, I'm gonna have to explain it to you later," she says quickly, and then looks back at the robber, who is now standing up and getting ready to take on these 3 soldiers. And so Jasmine looks at him and then pulls out a device from her pocket that looks similar to a cell phone and looks at it. Alrighty, he looks to be a level 2 threat and a consumption type. "You know what to do, Jim," she says as she looks to the man to her left. "Jake, you also know what to do," she says as she looks to her right. And the 3 split off, with Jim getting behind the robber and Jake getting to the right side of the robber, with and then quickly following, getting to the left side of the robber. And quickly the robber goes to attack Jim. However, Jim quickly turns his rod upside down and shoots wires out of the bottom of the rod, getting the robber wrapped and contained in all of the wires. However, the robber smiles at this.
You think this'll hold me?
He says as his body begins to morph into the pudding-like substance. But then Jim hits a button on the rod and a form of electricity comes spiraling down the wires and forces the robber's body to morph back into a human body. With the robber continuously trying to morph, these wires will not allow it. And then Jake quickly stabs the robber in the back with his rod and turns the bar-wheeled handle in the middle of the rod and causes the rod to morph into color, turning it into a more bluish rod, forcing the robber to not be able to absorb anything into his body, forcing the rod to truly stab into his back. And as he falls onto his knees, Jasmine walks up to him. A level 2 threat and an overconsumption type. "We deal with guys like you for breakfast," she says, as she then turns the wheeled barred handle on her spear, and the red tip on the spear then gets folded in and replaced by multiple pronged ends at the tip as she stabs them into the robber. Bright white light erupts from the end of Jasmine's spear as it connects to the robber, and it blinds Al and disintegrates the robber, and he has now vanished with an orb floating in the place the robber once was, and Jasmine grabs the orb. It is a light, round, blue lighted orb that, when you touch it, it feels somewhat gooey. And as she looks at it, she tells the orb, "I deny your acceptance," she says to it, and the orb vanishes. And with that, Al is just sitting there, jaw dropped, and trying to further wrap his brain around all the events that have taken place in a day that was supposed to be just a normal day. And Jasmine looks at him. "Well, are you gonna explain exactly what's going on?" he says to her, and she just tells him to rise. "I have a lot of explaining to do, I know, and we will do it, but not here. So follow us," she says. And so Al follows Jasmine, Jim, and Jake. "So you've been lying to me this whole time about what you do," says Al to Jasmine, and Jasmine, still walking, looks back. "Oh really, Al? You wouldn't have believed me if I told you what I did?" And Al responds angrily, "You don't know that. You have no idea what my reaction would be. I'd like to know what you actually do. I'd like to know who you are. I still don't know what the hell's going on," says Al. And Jasmine decides to begin ignoring him as she continues walking. And in the distance, there stands a man who had watched the entire thing play out and watched the entire event between Al and the robber. And the man stands in a nice, fitted, tailored suit, standing at a 6'3" with slicked back, platinum blonde hair. And the man pulls out a cigarette and lights it as he inhales the smoke. He looks into the sky. "He is only going to bring you harm, Jasmine. He's only going to cause you pain," he says, still inhaling the smoke of his cigarette, now putting his hands in the pockets of the tailored suit. And after Al, Jasmine, Jim, and Jake have walked, they approach an abandoned building, and Al looks at it, with Jasmine nodding at him to go inside, and so he does, being accompanied by the three of them. Jasmine leads Al through the abandoned building, and they walk up to a metal elevator, seemingly out of place of the abandoned building, and as it opens, they walk in, and he feels the elevator going down. So, what? This is some type of secret lab or some type of secret department, he says, and Jasmine looks at him. "You got it." "Of course. It's kind of cliche, don't you think?" says Al. And the elevator finally stops, and as they open, they walk into a much nicer area than the abandoned building, as it is seemingly just a normal police station. No fancy gadgets, no fancy anything, but nice desks with nice offices and glass doors with hanging portraits. And she walks him into an office with a long desk with multiple chairs as Jim and Jake take a seat on the table instead of the chairs. Al gladly sits on the chair, for he needs to sit down and take a breather, and Jasmine sits in the table across from him and enters a room. The chief, who is an old, withered-looking man, bald head with glasses, and it looks like he's struggling to even walk. However, the rest of the group, Jasmine, Jim, and Jake, seem intimidated by this man, and so Al follows suit, and be sure to not say anything to upset him, as the man makes his way to the end of the table and takes a seat, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. "Well, young man, you must be Al," says the old man, and Al just looks at him, confused on how he already knows his name, and then just assumes that Jasmine most likely has talked about him in the past. Yeah, that's my name," he says. And so the old man takes a sip of his whiskey and sets it down with a relaxing sigh and looks back at Al, staring him in the eyes. "Well, would you like to work for us and be an agent?" he says. And Al jaws just drops. What do you mean, work for you guys? Be an agent? I don't even know what you guys do, and now you're trying to recruit me? I don't even know what you guys are about. Why would I join an organization I know nothing about? He says. And so Jasmine decides to take over and use a teleprompter to put a screen on the wall and looks at Al. "We are an organization that hunts down orbs called genetic blessings," she says, and Al just looks at her dumbfounded. You're gonna have to explain that just a little bit more. I still don't know what you're talking about. You're gonna have to explain it much more than that," says Al, and so Jasmine continues the explanation. "You see, thousands of years ago, these orbs, who we have no idea who invented or where they came from, showed up on the planet Earth, and they are called genetic blessings, and they will grant the beholder of said orb incredible abilities after altering their genetics, turning them into godlike or superhero-like beings. If you say you accept the orb. However, if you say you deny the orb, it will kill the orb off." And Al looks at Jasmine. "Okay, so that robber, he accepted a genetic blessing, and it altered his body to make him that flubber-dubby thing, right?" And Jasmine nods. "Yes, that is exactly what happened, and we hunt them down, hopefully finding a genetic blessing before it's entered someone's body, but if it has, we must eradicate that person." "And why? Why do you eradicate them?" he says, and she just looks at him, happy that this man is so naive and so happy that he doesn't understand the evil intentions that most humans have. And so she says, "Well, it's simply because when someone becomes that powerful, when someone has an advantage over everyone else, they take advantage of it and become powerful beings, oftentimes wanting to rule the world. These genetic blessings have been around for thousands of years, like I said before, and the likes of Alexander the Great, Latina the Hun, and even Hitler were beholders of the genetic blessings, and they used them to become great, amazing threats that threw the Earth into chaos. Other higher level threats of the genetic orbs are not in our history, but in our folklore, like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or the Invisible Man, or Dracula, she says. And so now Al is very interested. "Now, I heard you talking about types and level threats. What are those?" says Al, now invested in this. And Jasmine responds, "Well, the types I will not get into until we start your training, if you choose to accept the position. However, I can get into the level threats. You see, a level 1 threat is someone who has absorbed a weak orb and has not had enough time to master its abilities. A level 2 threat is someone who has a medium powered strength orb, but yet still has lacked the time to master its abilities. And that was what the robber was, Al interjects. Yes, the robber had a medium power orb, which could have made him a level 4, 5, or 6, but he did not have the time to master it. And a level 3 threat is someone who has a weak orb, but has had it for quite some time and has had the time to master the abilities. However, they will never get past a level 3 threat. The level 4, 5, and 6 threats are people with the medium-powered orbs. However, they have had it for extended periods of time and has had time to master those threats. And someone with a level 7 threat is someone who has a strong powered orb with a lack of time to master the abilities. And level 8 and 9 and level 10 threats oftentimes are near godlike beings who have had incredibly strong orbs and extended amounts of time to master the abilities of those strong orbs, says Jasmine. And Al sits back. All right. And you'll explain the types later. I get that. And basically, you guys keep these genetic blessings from changing the course of our history or changing the course of our future, and refuse to allow them in strong positions of power. That makes sense, he says. And Jasmine looks at him. Yes. Unfortunately, in order to keep doing what we do, not everyone deserves to be eradicated, but it must be done to keep the equality of the human race and keep the human race from being non-existent, she says, or just being peasants or slaves to those who hold the genetic blessings. He ponders this. Al ponders this idea of what she just said. Those who don't deserve it. That's something that he doesn't think he could do, but he keeps it quiet. All right, I'll join. This sounds fun, and honestly, it sounds like a meaningful job, he says as he sighs with relief and leans back in the chair. And so the old man cheers his glass in the air towards Al and takes another drink of whiskey. Well, congratulations! Turn in your badge at the precinct tomorrow and start here with your new job and your new life. And training will begin at 8 o'clock in the morning tomorrow. Al nods, and Al leaves, with Jim standing by Jasmine's side. Do you really think that this is a good idea, Jasmine? Says Jim as he stands next to her. What do you mean? Says Jasmine. Well, responds Jim, bringing your lover into this. Remember what happened last time? Aren't you a little worried it'll play out the same way? No, not with Al, she says. And so she leaves the abandoned building and the department. And as she's driving home, her phone rings and the caller ID says that it is Al. And so when she answers, yeah, what's up? Al just looks into the phone. I wanted to say that I'm not okay with the secrets you've held from me, but I understand why, he says over the phone. And I know that you did not have any ill intentions. That's all I wanted to say. And then he hangs up. Jasmine seems concerned. She has never experienced Al just hanging up on the phone without saying goodbye or an I love you, and he doesn't seem his happy self. Of course, who would? Finding out everything that he's found out, having the day that he's had, she is sure he's busy trying to understand and wrap his brain around all of the current events. And so the following morning, Al wakes up, looking at the clock. Well, it wasn't a dream, he says, as he gets dressed and goes to Vegas with a bus pass, since his car was absorbed, and walks into the police precinct and throws his badge down. The chief looks at him. "What's this? Doesn't have anything to do with last night, did it?" he said, and Al looked at him. "Oh, only if you knew," he says. "But I quit. Bye." And Al walks out the door, leaving the chief speechless. And as he goes into the abandoned building and down the elevator, he walks in to his new home, his new job, seeing Jim, Jake, the chief, and Jasmine. "Well, welcome to the GBA," she says. "Is that what the name of this place is called?" says Al. "I can't even believe I accepted a job before knowing the name of the place." And so they start their training with Al in order to eradicate the genetic blessings. Meanwhile, the man with the slicked back, platinum blonde hair, and tailored suit sits in his chair, watching over a desk on a monitor of Al, Jasmine, Chief, Jim, and Jake as they're getting ready to start the day of training, and he lights up a cigarette. This is gonna be bad," he says to himself as he inhales the smoke. And that is part 1, chapter 1 of Genetic Blessings. I know that in the past I had some criticism of lack of footage that I did manage to remedy in my Tekken stories. However, that was before I turned this into a storytelling platform, a storytelling channel, and this is more of just a put in headphones and listen to type of content. So if you guys are still not liking just one photo throughout the whole video, absolutely let me know in the comments and I will change it. If not, I'll probably keep it that way and just put one photo in the videos of one of the characters or one of the objects that I am having in the story so that you guys can have a better visual effect of what exactly the characters look like and what the objects look like. With that being said, if you made it this far, thank you very, very much for listening. I hope you guys enjoyed. Take care of yourselves, don't get hit by a meteor, and bye.